In this recording, we're looking at this concept called SMART objectives, also sometimes referred to as SMART goals. The SMART is an acronym which stands for some very clear items. SMART means your goals and your objectives have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be attainable or achievable. They can't be things that are well beyond a student's capacity to try for. They should be relevant and they should be time bound. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. The concept of SMART goals and objectives is not unique to education. We find them in business, we find them in medicine, we find them in research. So they're a common approach to how we can organize our thinking about developing objectives for students to achieve. The idea is that if we have SMART goals or SMART objectives, then we will plan very clear and related activities that will help us reach those objectives. The more specific you are, the easier it usually is to plan and to be successful. So let's take a look at the specific areas here. The first one being being specific. What exactly are we going to do for whom? The specific part of a goal tells us who we are addressing with our goals in concrete terms. Is it a particular student or is it our class? Who do we want? For whom is this activity being planned? And what is it we're going to actually be doing? We want to be clear and we want to try to have verbs that are very specific, not sort of ambivalent or ones that are not really easy to measure. I can say student will understand a reading passage, but it's very difficult for me to actually understand or to measure concretely whether or not he or she understands. So I want to use verbs that are more specific. A lot of these are the kinds of words that come out of Bloom's taxonomy. So instead of saying student will understand a reading passage in the biology book, I might say student will read and analyze a specific passage related to cell division, so that I'm making it something that I can easily measure and easily explain in terms of what will be done. So we do want goals that are as specific as possible. Those of you who are in self-contained classes doing discrete trial teaching will notice that kids have very specific goals. They're almost micromanaged objectives of where they will do a very small portion of a task as a way to actually move on toward a broader or more comprehensive task. So they might be identifying simply a letter of the alphabet at first. They might be identifying a single coin with the hopes that the overall goal is eventually they'll be able to identify coins and represent amounts of money with those coins. So goals can be very specific. They can be very straightforward and almost micromanaged, or they can be a little bit broader. It really depends on what your students need or what the targeted outcome of the task is. Goals and objectives also have to be measurable. Can we quantify it in some way? How will we measure it? Can we count the number of times a student gets something right? Can we create a baseline? Excuse me. Jack maybe only identifies math facts from 1 to 5 correctly every once in a while. So what we're going to do is target that when presented with 3 math facts, 3 addition facts, adding numbers to the sum of 5, Jack will correctly add those numbers 4 out of 5 times. So we're going to be very specific in terms of how we measure it, the number of times we expect him to be accurate. Is he moving toward mastery, which is sometimes defined as 80% accuracy, sometimes 90% accuracy. That varies depending upon our students and the task. But we want to make sure that we can be very clear as to how that skill will be measured and what our criteria for achieving the skill will be. Then we want to look at how attainable or achievable. Is this a skill a student can learn or an individual can learn or acquire in the proposed amount of time we're thinking? In some cases, we might simply say, by the end of this lesson, Jane will correctly identify 3 letters of the alphabet, B, K, and M. And that's what we're going to really work on at this point in our lesson. We might say by the end of this lesson, students will be able to identify and explain one reason for the Civil War, if it's a history lesson. They might be able to identify and clearly explain one activity which occurs during cell division. You want to look at, is this an attainable or achievable goal in the amount of time that we have allotted? That varies a lot student by student. That's one of the reasons we really need to understand students' profiles. From there, we move on to whether or not a goal, an objective, or a goal is relevant. Is this really an important skill that a student needs in order to move on to a broader skill set? Does identifying letters help us learn to read? Yes, it does. Does it help to know math facts? It is necessary but not sufficient, or it's an important piece of doing mathematics. In some cases, some students don't necessarily retrieve or remember math facts and can still function mathematically. So we want to make sure it's relevant for the students with whom we're working. We want to look at the research. We want to look at what are best practices to help us understand whether or not this skill is an essential skill. Then we want to look at, is it time bound? When will this objective be accomplished? In some cases, it might be just by the end of this class. In some cases, it might be by the end of this marking period. And in other cases, it will be by the end of this academic year. If you have an opportunity to look at a student's IEP, IEPs generally create SMART goals, which are measured, which are reviewed annually. So they are looked at the end of a year's worth of time. In the meantime, they have smaller objectives, which are broken down, which might be measured over shorter periods of time, maybe 6 weeks, maybe a marking period. So that will vary depending upon the needs of the student and the nature of the program that you're in. When you write your SMART objectives, you're also then thinking right up front about what are the assessments you will be using to measure student progress. And that's very important. As I said previously, we'll look at assessment more as we move into the instruction modules. But knowing how you're going to assess whether or not a student is making progress is a critical piece both of planning and of instruction. So by doing that thinking up front as you create your SMART objectives, you're already well on your way to understanding and implementing a good assessment model in your instruction and in your program. By way of example, Getting Started shows us a sample frame, basically a sentence frame for how we might create or develop a SMART objective. By whatever, maybe it's a date, maybe it's the end of 3 lessons. Jack or the class will be able to identify a summarization strategy, and we will measure that by presenting a brief passage in which students will be able to identify 3 key details to support summarizing the content of that passage. There are a variety of ways in which SMART objectives can be written. You will have a sample lesson plan included in the student resources part of this Brightspace shell, which has some SMART objectives written. And there are lots of other sources for SMART objectives, and it's a good practice to just get in the habit of trying to create some of your SMART objectives for content you might be teaching. Also, ask your most of your cooperating teachers are probably familiar with SMART goals and objectives. They might be able to show you some examples from students with whom you're working in your current field placement. So that kind of gives us a basic approach to SMART objectives. And as I said, sometimes they are called SMART goals. We can manage them or micromanage them more to be SMART objectives. But they really are the uh, key elements of a task that we need to understand in order to teach our students, and we want to break them down into ways that are very manageable to help our students achieve mastery of certain skills if that's what we desire. All right, that takes us to the end of SMART objectives. We'll be talking a little bit more about these when we move into our instructional modules.